I chose to triple down on my personal brand because I wanted me and who I was to outlive the business. Eventually, value turns into, and impressions and eyeballs and trust will turn into money. Focus on building an audience. And when you build an audience, you monetize it. The podcast for me was not meant to make money. I think it was meant to build out a community.
Today on the show, I'm happy to have Scott Clary. He's the founder of the Success Story podcast. They are a top 10 business podcast, much larger than mine. Scott, happy to have you on today.
I'm very grateful to come on. Thank you. Thank you. No, and I've just been doing it for longer. That's it. Yours is going to get there. So don't worry.
So Scott, what's the model behind your podcast? I know we spoke about like how I monetize. I want to hear how you do it and how it works.
So I think that it's important to understand my mindset going into the podcast. So when I started a podcast, I was still building a business and I knew that business was going to be acquired at some point. So I chose to triple down on my personal brand because I wanted me and who I was to outlive the business, because I saw a lot of people, unless you have a seriously significant acquisition event or exit event, meaning like 50 million, 100 million plus, or you're just in some super innovative niche. I think that the second you sell a company, you're forgotten and you have to start from scratch. So I was looking at the Gary V's of the world that built massive audiences, and they were able to just launch products again against this audience that trusted them explicitly. And that's really what I wanted to build. When I first started, I did not start a podcast to achieve a business objective. I started a podcast to build a community or build a tribe or whatever you want to call it, just to get as many eyeballs just to know who I am as possible. And I knew that if I did that for a long enough period of time, there would be some financial benefit to doing that. And that's really the mindset that I had going in. Started off as a sales and marketing focused podcast because that was really where my career was at the time. And then it evolved to, it's interesting how a podcast evolves with you because it mirrors the conversations and the interest that you have as a host. So as I went through my career journey and my life journey, and the company was acquired and I wanted to keep the podcast going, obviously, because that was the purpose, I started to dive into more diverse topics. So it wasn't just sales and marketing. It was just business, entrepreneurship. It could be personal, professional development, upskilling, all these different things that I found interesting that I realized that I had to learn and incorporate into my life to be successful in anything that I did. And these are all topics and ideas that helped me become successful in business, but also in relationships and life and everything. So yeah, there was no goal to productize the podcast. It was to build the largest audience possible that loved my content, learned from my content, give as much value as possible. And then eventually value turns into, and impressions and eyeballs and trust will turn into money. If you keep it up for long enough, it's not the quickest way to monetize, but I think it's one of the most fulfilling ways. And it's one of the ways that could have outsized exponential returns in the long run if you do it for long enough. Because to productize right away what you're doing, there's no issue with that, because I think that's smart for some people that want to use a podcast for a very specific business objective, but it ends up being a little bit more transactional up front. And you're not going to build a cast as wide a net, because it doesn't serve you to cast as wide a net and to reach all these other people in all these adjacent categories or have all these ancillary discussions that don't benefit targeting somebody who's going to buy your product or service for your business. So again, focus on building an audience. And when you build an audience, you monetize it. And if you're not selling a product, course, widget, SaaS, CPG, where you have nothing to sell, you sell impressions. So it was just advertiser revenue coming in. And that's really been how the podcast has been self-sustaining for the past 6 years, really focused on landing major advertisers. I've worked with incredible brands. I've worked with HubSpot for almost 3 years now. I've worked with NetSuite, worked with Indeed, worked with LinkedIn as well. These are just some of the bigger ones. There's ones like Athletic Greens. I'm a big fan of their product, work with them, and a whole bunch of other smaller brands that are more niche. But it was really just attracting great advertisers that resonated with me personally and also resonated with the audience, and then use the trust and rapport that I built with my audience to bring great products in front of them. And again, that's one way to monetize. It's not the quickest way to make a ton of money, but the podcast for me was not meant to make money. It was meant to, I think it was meant to build out a community that later on I could use to launch again products or services, like I said. So it's achieving that objective, and the money that it makes really just gets rolled back into production and growth of the show. I don't really need to take the money out of the show. And I think that obviously that's a very, very good position and privileged position that I'm in. But that was part of the strategy. And that's also why I didn't just quit a job to start a podcast, which is a whole other conversation about good entrepreneurship and best practices for entrepreneurship, because I found ways to sustain myself so that doing the thing that I love could eventually turn into a full-time thing, but it didn't matter if it took a little while to get there, which I just think is a healthy way to think about entrepreneurship in general. So yeah, that's how I looked at monetizing it and building it out.
How far into it before the larger advertisers started becoming a piece of the puzzle here?
Um, about 3 years, about two and a
Oh,
half, 3 years. About 2.5, 3 years. Like when I was about, I'm just trying to think, about 100,000 downloads a year is when the bigger advertisers started to approach. There was like one-offs before, but we're talking like a couple $100 and they weren't renewing or they just weren't significant or they weren't long-term. Like some of the brands that I just mentioned, they're like year-long engagements or multi-year long engagements. And that was about 100,000 downloads about 3 years in.
what are you at today? Like, how much traction and download are you getting on the podcast?
I get between 700,000 to 1 million downloads a month across YouTube and audio. It ranges. Summer's a little bit slower. Right now, we're sitting on the lower end of that number, but we've been higher before. In podcast land, you'll see peaks and valleys, and summer is usually the quietest. For me, I'm hoping that we can like surpass that going into September, October, November. Also, very fortunate that the podcast is actually syndicated now through Cheddar. So I'm not counting, and what Cheddar is a major financial news media company, and they stream on Amazon Prime and Hulu and Netflix and not Netflix, Amazon Prime, Hulu, YouTube TV, excuse me, and a whole bunch of other spots that have live streaming. I don't have exact numbers on how many people are watching through those platforms, but they get significant reach. And that's a very new, try to keep podcasts evergreen, but this is more of a recent development. So hopefully that relationship keeps up. I love their team and they were looking for great business content. So I'll start to see how that distribution really impacts my numbers. And I have no idea yet, but it could be huge for us. And that's like another business lesson. Look for people that have networks and audiences that have already been built that you can tap into in some way, because that can really exponentially increase your growth quickly.
Definitely. And we were talking earlier a little bit about a slow and steady approach to releasing episodes versus kind of a speed round. What are your views on that?
I think it's very personal. I think it's based on what you can sustain for the long term. So I'm a big fan of a concept where the ideology that if you're going to build anything, you should find a way both very tactically as well as mentally to commit to that thing for up to 10 years when you're first starting. And when you start to commit to something for 10 years, what that does is it allows you to understand how are you going to maintain this thing financially, how much energy, how much bandwidth you need to devote to it so that it can actually maintain for 10 years. It starts to make you think differently. So you ask, should you try and speed run a podcast, or should you try and do an episode a week or 2 episodes a week or an episode every 2 weeks? I think you have to have a really hard, real discussion with yourself when you're first starting about, if I'm going to do this for 10 years, can I do 5 episodes a week? Do I have the bandwidth? Is it going to cost me money to hire an editor? And how much money can I actually afford to hire an editor? Maybe I have unlimited money. Maybe I don't. Maybe I have to be very, very careful about my resources. How much time do I have? If I can hire an editor, can I even afford 5 hours of interview plus another couple hours of prep for each one of those interviews every single week? Is that the style of podcast that I want? Can I afford 5 hour-and-a-half sessions if I want to do hour-and-a-half podcasts? Or maybe I'm just doing a short, like John Lee Dumas is 30 minutes interview virtual, and he does 5 of those a week. Maybe you want to do in person. Obviously, a lot more logistics and time required to do an in-person show. Maybe you want to do video. Maybe you just want to do audio. Video creates a whole bunch of headaches that audio doesn't, right? If you just want to do a daily audio show. So answer is very personal, but you have to understand bandwidth and resource allocation so that you can stick with it for a long period of time. And if you stick with something for a long period of time, you start to make it unreasonable for you not to be good at it, and for you not to be able to build an audience, or for you not to be able to make some money and increase your revenue doing the thing. So I think that's the way you have to look at it. And I don't agree with speed running anything, because I think speed running means that you are fooling yourself into thinking that if you just front load all of this energy and all these resources, you're going to have this quicker positive outcome that's going to make it eventually sustainable. But everything that I've ever built takes more time and more money than I first thought. And I think that's a recipe for burnout. And I think it's almost like you're gambling on the business if you try and speed run anything. I just have never seen an example of somebody doing that successfully, like trying to beat the shot clock on their business. I've never seen that work out in their favor. So just based on my like learned and lived experience and all the entrepreneurs that I know, give yourself twice or three times as much time and twice or three times as much money to the thing as you think that you're going to need. And then you'll still have to work hard. But yeah, you have to give it some time.
No, I really like the 10-year window, right? Come in with that approach. It's with mine right now. I'm doing something similar. If you burn out in year 3, what was the point? And I
What's
think,
the point?
yeah, from the shared experiences we've had of like running businesses, right? I know my last business, year 7, I was done. I was tapped. I went too fast.
Year 7 is a lot. Year 7, you gave it some time. That's not bad. But still, if at year 7, listen, I don't know what your financials were, but at year 7, if you're not taking home like $500,000 per year minimum, like just go get a job or find a way to pivot at that point. Like year
Yeah.
7 is a lot. Year 7, I think that you've given it a concerted effort. And there is something at year 7, if you are not making enough money to pay yourself at least that much, you have some product market fit problem, or you have some, there's like another version of product market fit where like pain market fit, like you're not really solving a problem that people care about, or there's a messaging problem or something like that. But something needs to be radically shifted because yes, it does take some time to find product market fit, but at the 7-year mark, it should be in that growth and scaling mode and pouring fuel on the fire. If you're still trying to figure it out, then there's something missing there. And I'm being facetious saying you should get a job if you're entrepreneurial. You never will. But the point is, there has to be some radical shift in what you're doing because that's a red flag, I think.
No, it's a good point though. You should get a job if you're not making that kind of money. Guess it's a business is brutal. So like by year 6, it was doing 4.2 million and I was taking home like 700K a year. It was a good business.
Okay.
Now, it
That's
also
good.
was, I wasn't sustainable. So it got to a point where I'm like, this thing is going to break me if I continue to push it at this level without getting the right team in place.
But
And
if you're
then,
taking home 700, why can you not? You can hire a CEO, like a decent quality caliber CEO, COO that can build us some SOPs and codify what you know. There's budget in there for that, for sure.
exactly. And that was the stage it was at. And then shortly thereafter, COVID hit and business was stopped.
Yeah, I think that also, I think so. There was a company that I joined and I led sales and marketing and was eventually acquired by private equity. And right before I had joined, it was founder owned. I think it was doing about eight or 9 million. And I think about half of that revenue was founder source deals and revenue, which is wild, but not that uncommon. And the rest of it was coming from a small sales team. And it was at that point that he realized that he was going to break if he didn't hire a COO because he was still running around trying to run. I'm sure there's probably about a 35 person company. Plus he was closing about $4 million in deals himself. And that's also not sustainable. And it was like a very low margin business. It was in hardware. So like telecom hardware. So yeah, I think you just have to, that's like a problem that all founders have though. Like they get so into their business and they feel like no one else can do it like them, which is not wrong. No one else is going to have the same passion for what you're building as you. But there is a point where if you are carrying 50% of your company's revenue yourself and you're still running around and you're working like more hours a week and you never see your family, first of all, your quality of life sucks. You've built yourself a super high paying job. And also you're not acquirable. Like nobody will buy that business if you're doing 50% of the company's revenue and you're the one also managing all the people. So I think you'll have that wake up call everybody will have that wake up call, but that's a very crucial, there's very crucial inflection points in businesses. And I think that when you realize that if the founder doesn't remove themselves, the business is going to die or they will. That's one of those inflection points, right? Where you have to start to hire help. I didn't know that your business went belly up during COVID. That sucks. That really sucks too.
It was all right. It was 18. So I had 18 employees in this thing
Yeah.
and it was very labor intensive.
Yeah.
And all right, it was time to, I'm glad it's gone. It's a
Yeah.
nightmare business. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
returns
So
logistics to say, where we had trucks of returns coming from Amazon, Walmart, and Target, and we had a big warehouse facility, and I had factory workers refurbishing goods. I'm very happy to do a podcast and do digital now and make it
yes,
scalable and hire good teams and talent. And oh yeah, much better method.
that does seem like a headache. However, you still could have built that business, and you still could have, at some point, you can always fire yourself from a business. It's just a matter of how fast, right? Yes,
Yeah.
it's a little bit faster with a self-serve software product. Of course, you could fire yourself almost immediately outside of, especially if you are a sales and marketing co-founder and you have a technical CTO co-founder, and you can find a way to generate positive ROAS right out of the gate, and you can wrap that and take that money and hire a great marketer, and they can scale that. Same with, this is why ecom is so popular as well. But if you have a SaaS product, you could fire yourself almost out of the gate. I know people that are running Chrome extensions that are doing $1 million a year, and they're working like 2-3 hours a week. It's pretty wild what SaaS can do, but that's all about leverage, right? So you have to be smart about what you get into. But now you're in media. So there's a whole bunch of leverage there too, a whole bunch of leverage opportunities, because you think about it, the work you do now, I think about this all the time. So the work I do now has not changed fundamentally from when I started the podcast. And the work I will do in the future will probably be even less work, but revenue increases exponentially. So if I record an hour podcast and it gets seen by 10 people or 50 people or 500,000 people or 5 million people, it is still an hour and a half podcast. Now I've upskilled myself so I can ask better questions and I can have a better conversation and I'll get better guests. But ultimately, it's not that different from when I first started. I'm just less nervous now. That's the only difference. But
One other thing I wanted to get into is your Michelin star story and how that
yeah,
was a different way of something coming to be.
the reason why, when we were doing a little chat before we started this, you had said something about your business, and you'd said like you were starting a podcast for your business, but we were talking about how the podcast shouldn't just be like a marketing channel for your business. It should stand alone and be so good that it competes with other podcasts, whether or not it has a business function to it or a business value to it. And the story of Michelin and the so Michelin obviously is the tire company. And you also know Michelin star, which is like the restaurant rating system. And yes, they are related. So what Michelin, the tire company, originally did, you think about a tire company, think about how old Michelin was. We're talking like decades old. They created tires. And when they were creating tires, there was not a lot of people who were driving. So they realized that if they want to make more tires and get more business, they need more people on the roads driving. So they're like, how do we get people to drive more? And what they decided to do was they decided to make a guide of the best restaurants in Europe, because they were a European based company, that people could road trip to. And they would rate these restaurants, and people would want a road trip outside of their city because they couldn't, they like, obviously, if you're inside your city, it's a little bit easier to get around. I'm sure at this point, there was probably still some horse drawn garages, but if you want to go on long distance trips, car was the way to go, but there had to be incentive. There had to be a reason to go somewhere else. So Michelin was like, let's put together a guide of the best restaurants around Europe, and we'll incentivize people and almost dangle a carrot. Look at what you could go be eating at this restaurant all the way over here. Guess how you're going to get there? You're probably going to have to get a car. And they wanted to do this so that people would drive more. That was really the goal, to sell more tires. So fast forward, that guide has turned into the Michelin star guide for restaurants, rating the best restaurants in Europe. The point is, they created this ancillary product that was originally meant to help their core business, but it was so good and it stood alone so well that ultimately it became a thing of its own. And now the Michelin star guide for restaurants is such an important thing for chefs and restaurant owners and also bougie ass foodies to pay attention to, that they don't even know that it was actually originally created by Michelin as a reason to sell more tires. So the point is, obviously, this took decades to evolve into what it is right now. But if you can create something that helps your business, like a podcast, make it so good that people listen to the podcast without ever knowing that it was actually created to serve a business function. And I think that when people think about marketing or creating anything, creating a YouTube channel, creating content on social, they think of it as like a means to an end. And I think that means to an end, I understand why, because they're just trying to achieve a business objective. But I think that if they thought of it as, would this Instagram page be interesting even if you didn't buy a product from me? Or would this podcast be great to listen to even if you didn't buy my product or service? I again think they will have outsized returns and different opportunities to potentially monetize that they never even thought possible before. So I really think that's a great story to take a lesson from, because if you can create this marketing asset that stands alone, it's going to have massive returns for your business. But I think it's going to be like just this huge net positive for you as a business owner or a founder. So that's the Michelin story, which is one of my favorite stories. But I think that's a great marketing lesson too.
Yeah. And just taking care of what you do, right? If you're going to put the time into something,
Mhm.
put some energy into it. Even if it's
Agreed. Don't
serving,
half-ass it. How many brands half-ass anything they do? They half-ass their social. They half-ass the corporate podcast they put out. They half-ass whatever. It's wild to me. And what's wild to me is they half-ass all this stuff, and the companies that don't half-ass it stand out. Like Duolingo does not half-ass their social, and they've won marketing awards, and everybody knows a stupid green owl from Duolingo, and they have a billion views on TikTok. If you were ever going to learn a language, who else would you go with? I haven't even had a chance to learn a second. I know French, but not outside of French and English. I may have to learn Spanish, because now I'm down in Miami. So it's like a thing that you got to do. But if I'm going to go learn a language, that's where I'm going, because they have created this phenomenal tied into culture marketing powerhouse across all their social. The woman that masterminded this whole Duolingo marketing strategy, she's won awards for this marketing strategy now. Point is, if you're going to create anything, create it to a level of excellence that it could compete with another Instagram channel that's just informative or just entertainment. Or if you're going to create a podcast for your business, create something that is, again, on par with the biggest podcasts in the world. And the brands and the companies, they have the resources to do this, but they don't. And I think they should.
if anybody in our audience wanted to listen to your podcast and the amount of energy and effort you put into that, how could they do so?
You go to successstorypodcast.com. You can listen to everything there. All the socials at Scott D. Clary. So I'm pretty easy to find. But yeah, hope you guys all enjoy it. We do more stuff like this.
Yeah, definitely. Everybody make sure to check out Scott's podcast. It's really a great listen. I listen to quite a few episodes whenever I have the time. And thank everybody for listening to another episode of Failing to Success. If you like the show, make sure to subscribe. I'm your host, Chad Kalecki, and we'll see you next time.